Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I will try to be more careful in recording this podcast than I was in the last one, where I occasionally misnamed the author of the book and also the title of the book. Uh, as I said, I probably should not be recording podcasts in the middle of the morning. It's now almost 3 a.m. where I am. But I just feel a sense of, I guess, urgency is the best word to talk about this. Having just watched a show on one of the channels I subscribe to on YouTube, really good channel. I'll actually put a link to that story on YouTube, that program, that news story on YouTube, in below this podcast. If I seem a bit out of sorts, it is because I am out of sorts. I look at what's happening in the world, and I just feel a sense of futility. When you watch that video that I will place the link to below this podcast, I think you will know what I mean. I realize increasingly that there is literally nothing materially that I can do for the Gazans. Nothing I can do. I really wish there were. I really wish I could be fighting alongside the Gazans. Now, could I realistically, an almost 68-year-old man with osteoporosis and osteoarthritis? Most likely not. And I assume I would be more of a hardship for the other people fighting than a benefit. Maybe not. Maybe there is something I could do, but I don't know what. It's just so depressing. I feel a sense of shame almost at being a human being and watching other people who claim, I would say, unjustifiably to be human beings, meaning to have a sense of humanity, which is my definition of a human being. Homo sapiens, yes. Human beings, no. And so I literally don't know what to do. In that video, I hope you watch it, from Novara Media. Really, really good channel, and it's a good channel to subscribe to. They are very sympathetic. It's a really good channel. Unfortunately, it does not get talked about enough. It is citizen supported. It is not a commercial channel. So again, I would encourage you, when you watch that video, before or after, probably after is better, because you'll have a reason to subscribe, not just doing it because I say so or because I recommended it. But watch the video, then please subscribe. Please. Please help them in any way you can. I don't know if you can help them, but if you can, please do so. My sense of futility seems to grow by every moment. I attended a meeting this past week where this one person said a prayer for the IDF soldiers. What did I feel like? I won't even say. There's no point in saying what I felt like. If you've been watching my channel for a while, you know what I feel. But there was no point in speaking. This person had thoroughly compromised, had so completely bought into the Israeli narrative that what the IDF is doing is good. In that video that I will link below this podcast, you see IDF soldiers smiling with thumbs up, bragging about committing inhumane acts, crushing human bones with their tanks, claiming that they could hear the sounds of those bones being crushed. Again, I question whether they are really human beings. If they are human beings, then I do not envy them at all. I am a spiritual man, in addition to being a Maoist third worldist and a critical realist. And I believe in judgment. I strongly feel that these people will be judged for their acts. I almost never talk about those kinds of things in this series of podcasts. In fact, this may be the first time I've done so. I'm not sure. But I'm simply not sure what else to say. The kinds of atrocious acts being committed by these people goes against every sense that I have in my being of morality. As most of you should know, at least regular watchers of this podcast, of which I realize there are not that many. I'm under no delusions about that. I'm a moral realist, not a moral relativist. That means that I believe that morality is not situational. There is no situation ethics. Morality is real. And the fundamental aspect of that morality is emancipation. In this case, I don't know what else to call it, so I'll call it as I see it. In this case, it is emancipation from Zionism. I'm trying to avoid being political because I feel that being political simply increases tribalism. People who will agree with me will agree with me, and people who do not will not. But if I just constantly repeat the refrain of I despise Zionism, inevitably I'm going to alienate some people who may be watching my podcast, who may, for reasons unknown to me, actually be Zionists. Sadly, I have known Zionists. I am not sure if I told you this story before, but if so, it still bears repeating. The Unification Church, founded by the Reverend Sun Myung Moon and his wife, was a movement that I had studied as a sociologist of religion. And as I got very close to them, I had several friends who were members of that church. I no longer do. Maybe one of them might consider herself a friend of mine, but I haven't heard from her in years. The other one completely dismissed me as a friend because of my views. Tell you what happened. Back when I was still living in the Kansas City area, Olathe, Kansas, I had contact with the local Unification Church in Kansas City, Missouri. And got a call from this guy who I knew. I think his title was director of that particular church. I don't know if he was a minister, but I knew he directed it. And he called me up one day and said, "Mark, I would like to have you come to this gathering in a restaurant." And I said, "Well, that's nice. Thank you." I said, "Any reason why?" He said, "No, we're just having a gathering." He was lying to me. He was blatantly lying to me. But I said, "Why not?" Actually, I didn't say why not to him. I said, "Why not?" to myself. To him, I said, "Sure, of course, I'll go." So I showed up there at a restaurant. The restaurant was actually on the Kansas side where I lived. And there was a man there, a Japanese man, whom I had never met before. And there was a young lady, I don't know how old she was. I would guess somewhere in her 30s. This is going back like 20 years. So I was about maybe 48 or so. And he was a pimp. Did I call him that? No, I did not call him a pimp. Maybe I should have, but in retrospect, what would that have accomplished? It might have made me feel good, but it wouldn't have done anything to correct the situation. But he was a pimp, at least as I define that term. What he was doing, he had traveled to the US as a Japanese man with many Japanese women. His objective was to marry them off. If you know anything about the Unification Church, they place a great deal of emphasis on marriage and the family. In fact, when the church was first started, all marriages were arranged either by Moon or one of his associates. And they were mass marriages. I think one was held in Yankee Stadium in New York. I don't know if this marriage would have been done in that way. I mean, Of course, I wouldn't have married her anyway, but the man walked up to me, this Japanese fellow walked up to me, and he said, you know, I think that you might be happy in a marriage with this woman. I was immediately startled because no one had told me what the purpose of the meeting was. That's what it was. That was the only reason why it existed. They had already paid for my lunch. I was still trying to figure out why I was there. I was the only guest in attendance, so it really didn't make much sense to me until then. And he said, it would be so nice having a meeting between a Japanese woman and a Zionist. Obviously, he assumed I was a Zionist. One of the most incorrect things that is imaginable. I come from an anti-Zionist Jewish background. My family was non-practicing, as many of you undoubtedly know. When I was very young, we did celebrate Hanukkah and Passover. Maybe commemorate is a better word. That shows how little I know about it. I was bar mitzvahed, which again is a term that most religious Jews would not use. They would say, I had a bar mitzvah. Secular Jews, at least in New York, tended to say I was bar mitzvahed. In other words, they made it into a verb. And I had a Brit Milah, a covenant of circumcision. I mean, I did it because I was living in a Jewish neighborhood. I grew up in two Jewish neighborhoods in New York City. One in the Pelham Parkway section of the Bronx on Wallace Avenue, and the second in the Bayside section of Queens on the corner of Springfield Boulevard and 67th Avenue. That's where I grew up. Both non-practicing Jewish neighborhoods. I remember there was one person who was not Jewish in my neighborhood. To me, she was an oddity. Having spent my entire life to that point living in Jewish neighborhoods, I assumed that she was the minority in the US at that time, because that's all I had known were Jews. She was a Roman Catholic woman, very nice person. Didn't know her very well. She basically kept to herself. My parents knew her a bit, but not as well as they knew the other people in the neighborhood. In any event, were my parents anti-Zionists? No. Were they extreme Zionists? No. They just liked Israel. That's basically all you can say. They liked Israel. They belonged to the B'nai B'rith and the Anti-Defamation League, which at that time was a part of the B'nai B'rith. It is no longer. But when I was a kid, it was. I'm not sure exactly when the two organizations split into two. My mother was also involved in Jewish Women's Ort, and I must admit that till this day I have no idea what that organization was. Other than that, it was an organization for Jewish women, but I don't know what they did. I've never looked it up. Be easy to find out, but I've never had a reason to look into it. In any event, the situation was so heart-wrenching being at that restaurant, having that Japanese man make that unfounded assumption about me that I was a Zionist. After I left, not when I was there, often we'll think of things that we wish we would have said, but we didn't say. This is one of those examples, but honestly, I'm happy I didn't say it. It wouldn't have accomplished anything if I had called him a pimp, which is, I think, what he was. At least by my definition of what a pimp is. I expressed no anger toward him. Not only that, but I did something I should not have done. I did what this Japanese man wanted out of courtesy, which I should not have shown him. It's one thing not to call him a bad name. It's quite another to follow his instructions. He asked me if I would go with this woman to the Oak Park Mall, which is a big mall, a typical suburban mall in Johnson County, Kansas, literally a few blocks away from where I worked. And I said, okay. My feeling was, well, I'll meet somebody new, I didn't think of it as I probably should have thought of it, that I was giving in to this man who called me a Zionist, prompting my response, what makes you think I am a Zionist? To which he did not respond. Again, an example of something I thought about that I should have said, which I didn't say. Until you answer that question, which he didn't, of why you think I am a Zionist, I will simply leave unless you do that. Now, do I know why he thought I was a Zionist? Yeah. The Unification Church is very insular. Its political ideology is neoconservative, extremely pro-American, very, very pro-American. I remember during the Watergate hearings, members of the Unification Church from New York, some people whom I knew, traveling to Washington, D.C., and staging a demonstration in favor of Richard Nixon. That is something I never forgot. At that point, I knew immediately who these people were. And in my head, I shouldn't feel this way, but I did. I'm being honest. I said, in my head, just in my head, these people are my enemies. And I still feel that way. As a communist, as a Maoist third worldist, I mean, the whole agenda of the Unification Church was something called Godism. That's what they called it, Godism, which is really what this video is about. Talking about my encounter with that Japanese man and that woman whom he was trying to marry me off to was really just a preface to this. Godism was an anti-communist ideology that was developed presumably by Reverend Moon, or at least people associated with him. What they did is they took the Marxian version of the dialectic, which they misunderstood completely anyway, but that's neither here nor there, and they replaced it with their own model of existence. And to them, the world was dual. The way they explained that duality in Godism and in unification theology in general was through Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel, the sons of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. And to them, Abel was the good son. Cain was the bad son. Cain killed Abel. And so they took that Cain and Abel model and they applied it to all of human history. To them, everything that has ever happened in the world could be reduced to a modification of the Cain and Abel story. So the Soviet Union, which existed at that time, was Cain. The United States was Abel. Basically, anything which opposed the United States was Cain. Now, they defended that by saying, well, we're not condemning the left, although they always did. They despised the left. They were like the purest form of right-wingers. They published the Washington Times, which was a far right-wing newspaper in Washington, D.C. They also published other newspapers, including one called News World, which did not last that long in New York City. And generally, they tended to give it out for free. I remember my friend Richard, whenever I would see him, would always try to give me a copy of it. And I would say, Richard, you're wasting it on me because all I'm going to do is throw it into the trash. I was blunt. Probably wouldn't be that blunt today, but in those days I was pretty blunt. I had not yet really acquired much empathy as an autistic. So I just said exactly what I thought. In a way, that's maybe not too bad, but I would not deal with it that way now. But in any event, when you read the Washington Times or read the Washington Times or News World, their editorial page was entirely set up according to this Cain and Abel model. Everything was literally Cain and Abel. That's how they saw the world. It was a battle between anything which was in alignment with US interests, including capitalism. They were really, and still are, really strong supporters of capitalism. And they were profound enemies of communism. I have never known anybody else besides the Moonies or the Unificationists. Most people in that movement I have known would actually call themselves by both terms. They were not offended by being called Moonies. Maybe some were, but not the people that I knew. In any event, these people who were in the Unification Church or members of one of the other organizations associated with it, I've never known anybody that was that far to the right, that was that neoconservative. They used to chant, "Rah, rah, America." Sounded kind of odd to me, but I don't know where that came from. It may have related to the Korean ancestry of Reverend Moon, maybe. I don't know that. Maybe. That's a possibility. One time they were holding a conference in Quebec City, which is a beautiful city. I was only there that one time. They had rented out rooms in this wonderful hotel called the Chateau de Frontenac, which is right on the St. Lawrence Seaway. There's like a walkway right along the seaway, and then right in front of that is the Chateau de Frontenac, which actually was a castle. And but the rooms were tiny, tiny, and not very well kept, but very expensive. I did not pay for it. My bill was picked up by them. They were trying to attract academics to Godism and to the Unification Church in general. What occurred at that event, to me, was humorous. I'm sure it wasn't humorous to them, but I found it to be humorous because I thought, well, what's the worst that could happen? We'll just go back to New York. They got up to the registration desk and they found that apparently they had made reservations. At least they said so. And I mean, I can't imagine them not making reservations before you go to a hotel. But for whatever reason, the Chateau de Frontenac lost the reservations. So there were no rooms for us. Fortunately for them, and maybe fortunately for me, I have no idea, they were able to find individual rooms scattered around the hotel. Originally, we were all supposed to be in one area, but they couldn't do that because of they had no registration information on us. somebody screwed up, whether it was on the Unification Church side or on the Chateau de Frontenac side, or maybe both. It was an interesting conference. But again, pure anti-communism. Till this day, I don't know why they kept on inviting me to these things. I have never made a secret of the fact that I was a communist. At that time, I was a Titoist, a Marxist, Leninist Titoist. That's what I was at that time when I went there. And I believe very strongly in socialism in one country. And I thought that Tito's market socialism was a very good example of it, and one that could perhaps be emulated in the US. I no longer feel that way, but I did back then. I went through various turns in communism. That was my second turn. The first was the New Left, which was really not a tendency, it was just a movement. But my first tendency was Titoism. And I stayed in Titoism for a couple of decades, a long time. And I would openly announce myself as a Titoist. So them being anti-communist and inviting me to these Godism conferences where they had these elaborate pictures of Godism and these other pictures which attacked Marxism and communism. To me, to be honest, I found the whole thing to be very entertaining, which is why I went. I thought, why the heck are these people inviting me here? They know I'm a commie. I guess they didn't care. That was not their priority. What they cared about was that I was an academic who was open to going to their events. That's all they cared about. And so until that situation happened with that pimp at that restaurant, they kept on inviting me to things. That ended it. Literally, that ended it. I don't know if it was because they felt embarrassed. I hope so. For their own sakes, I hope they felt embarrassed. That would at least show that they had a sense of shame. But I have no way of knowing that. Maybe they just felt, well, this guy's really not a very good catch after all. So I never heard from them again. That was a long time ago. And then eventually my friendship with Richard ended. And what the heck, I'll tell you what happened. Hadn't planned to. Richard was gay. I am a very strong supporter and ally of LGBTQIAA, to use the full acronym as I have heard it. Always been a very close supporter, including when I was working, or I was one of the advisors to the gay and lesbian club on campus. They liked me. There were some professors who were very anti-gay who were there, which really bothered me. I knew who they were. I knew who they were because they made no secret of it at all. But not me. Not me. So I have tremendous respect for gays and lesbians because I always think of myself. I am a cisgender straight man. But say I were a gay man and maybe a trans woman as well, but gay man is enough. I know how I would want to be treated. So I guess I was practicing kind of a version of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I was very compassionate because I thought, if I were in their situation, how would I feel? How would I feel? That occupied my mind all the time. Whether it was gays or bisexuals or lesbians, trans people, I had tremendous affection for people with, as they commonly say in the UK, gender and sexual diversity, or GSD. That's a common expression in the UK, not in the US, but I like it. It's simple. You don't have to worry about adding all these letters. You just say GSD. So it makes it clear and precise. For whatever reason that has not caught on in the US, I actually hoped it would, because it would make it easier to remember. But regardless, I've always been sympathetic to them. But Richard, I mean, I had known Richard since 1971. This was in, I don't know, like 2 years ago. For some reason, Richard said to me that, you know, I suddenly find you to be very attractive. Now, if he did not know who I was, that would be one thing, but he knew who I was. And so I was honestly offended by that statement. I thought it was rude, inappropriate. So I didn't speak with him for a while. After a while, I decided to call him and maybe try to make up with him in some way, or I don't know, reestablish the friendship. But not him. Not him. He was angry at me. Why? I have no idea. I don't think he was really angry at me. I think he was embarrassed for himself. And he couldn't deal with me as a result of that. I can't prove that, but that's my impression. Richard was always a very strong proponent of Godism, which is based on unificationism, or the theology of the Unification Church. But again, the Godism, which I want to emphasize, was the specifically anti-communist ideology that was developed by the Unification Church. And I attended their workshops, which is really weird. A communist going to anti-communist workshops. But I found them interesting. As a sociologist of religion, that's my thing. I don't care whether I agree with something. I just like exploring different things. So I would go and listen to these lectures. Some were in person. Some were recorded. Put a headset on, watch it on a TV monitor. And I found it to be very intriguing. But obviously, you would think that they would have known that I wasn't going to become a godist or a unificationist. That simply would not happen. So, in conclusion, I started out talking about this incident with this woman, but I did that basically as a way of setting the stage, showing the kind of right-wing ideology that they have, where without knowing me, they assumed, well, this guy's from a Jewish background. He must be a Zionist. I don't know how many people would make that assumption. I'm sure a lot would, but it was not surprising at all with them. So I think taking that experience, and look, do I blame them in retrospect? That was a long time ago. No, I don't blame them. I harbor no ill feelings toward them. They were acting on the basis of their conscience, of their belief system, which is what I do as well. But as a Maoist third worldist, as somebody who treasures the third world, I have difficulty with unificationism. They are pro South Korea, pro North Korea, and anti South Korea. I mean, right then and there, you can tell it was not a marriage made in heaven. They were anti North Korea, well, for a couple of reasons. One, because it's communist, I guess. Although I've read some of their Jewish literature, and they distance themselves in a way from Marxism, Leninism, but then they say there are some parallels. So their literature is a bit confusing, and I've read, I think, all of it in English. I made a point of reading all of it, but it's very impressive. Whoever wrote it gave a lot of thought to it. But the second reason why they are so hostile toward North Korea, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, is because the DPRK held Reverend Moon in a prison camp. He was a POW. He was a prisoner of war. Now that aspect I can understand. I mean, if I was a prisoner of war someplace, I wouldn't have a very positive view of those people, most likely. I don't know. Fortunately, I've never been a prisoner of war. But anyway, that part I can relate to. The Godism thing, nah, not the Godism thing, not the unificationism thing, not Reverend Moon, who's deceased now, but who allegedly beat his children. Now, there's not just one Unification Church. Last I checked, there are 4 of them. One is run by his widow. 2 are run by his sons. And a third is run by somebody unrelated to the Moon family. And they all despise each other. One of them, in fact, has become almost like a militia. They literally stockpile weapons in preparation for what they talk about as the apocalypse. They think that they will need those weapons to defend themselves. The original Unification Church, run by Reverend Moon's wife now, at least last I checked, has openly condemned them. But again, they all hate each other. That is like the stereotypical dysfunctional family. And that dysfunctional family was created by Reverend Moon, by how he treated his own children. I mean, he made his family dysfunctional. He was not a very nice man. Now, his followers, of course, would not agree with that. But any objective analyst who looks at that movement knows that. For a time, he accepted this one guy, fellow, I believe he's from someplace in Africa, as the reincarnation of his deceased son. I forget how his son died. Might have been a plane crash, but I'm not sure. And this alleged reincarnation of his son began beating people at his meetings. For a long time, Reverend Moon tolerated that until he eventually did not and kicked him out. Well, that's what you would expect a Messiah to do, right? In Unificationism, the Messiah is dual. Not dual in the sense of Cain and Abel, but dual in the sense of what they call father and mother. Father is Reverend Moon and mother is his wife, now widow. And to Unificationists, at least the original ones, they are the messianic couple. One of the factions opposes his widow and argues that she misled her husband. So they became a splinter group, even while Reverend Moon was still alive, which is very unusual in religious studies. You don't see that all the time. Usually splintering begins after the founder dies. This one did not. Moon was still very much alive, but this guy said, you cannot trust Moon anymore. He's being manipulated by his evil wife. What do you make of that? I have no idea. So, point of this is to say that I think it's important to consider the unification movement, including among Maoist Third Worldists, to be aware of it at least, even superficially. In my case, it's not superficial. I literally understand their theology backwards and forwards. I've not gotten into that because there's no point, but I could literally give a lecture on the unification theology and on the Godism theology. I could. I've studied it that much as a sociologist of religion. I don't hate them. I don't like them too much either, but I don't hate them. I don't see them generally as my enemies, but I see their belief system as my enemy, and people who accept that belief system, well, I guess they are my enemy. I don't know. But I don't hate them. I don't hate them. I try to be as respectful as I can. But as somebody who was a commie, who was not opposed to the DPRK, I mean, I would like to see the unification of the two Koreas, but not on South Korea's terms. But the DPRK has largely been twisted by the US and the global media, the Western media. Most Westerners have a really, really incorrect idea of what life in the DPRK is like. Most people in the DPRK are farmers. But then you have people who live in Pyongyang, capital city, who are professors, who are business owners. I mean, it's a big city, Pyongyang. Not as big as Seoul, South Korea, but still big. And so again, it's kind of like everything that the Unification Church, everything that Godism supports, I oppose. And that's been true since the early 1970s. I became a commie when I was 68. So not having contact with them anymore doesn't matter. In the Rio Grande Valley where I am, there are, to the best of my knowledge, no unificationists anyway. The fact that the movement has been splintering so much, anybody in my field can tell you what that means. It means that the movement is falling apart. It's lost its cohesion. That's why movements fall apart. That's why religious movements fall apart. The charismatic leader, Reverend Moon, dies. Well, even before he died, it started falling apart, but not as much as after he died. It's hard keeping any religion together after the charismatic leader has departed. It just is. That's a fact. That's a fact, Jack. That's how religions are. Religions are kind of finicky things. They depend upon leaders and much more than most other organizations do. Most other organizations, leaders are kind of expendable. They can fire somebody, hire somebody else. Not so with religions. The leader is often seen as being a messiah, an avatar, a Satguru, a sant, a messiah, whatever. And that was true with Moon, with Reverend Moon. So I think it's really only a matter of time. How much time, I don't know. Before the entire movement, and by the entire movement, I mean all 4 sects of the movement, die out. Like many religions, the Unification Church grew rapidly in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Since that time, like many other new religious movements, including the Hare Krishnas, the Jehovah's Witnesses, well, I mean, I could name a bunch of others. I was going to say the Mormons, but the Mormons are kind of an exception because the Mormons are older, and they've managed to survive because of their emphasis on the family. But the Children of God are another example. They still exist under a new name, the Family. They're falling apart too. It's hard to keep a religion together. And most movements that developed around that time have not grown since that time. So they're stuck with a bunch of baby boomers, people from my generation. And we are dying out, you know? I mean, it's only a matter of time before I die. We are dying out. And so I don't think that unificationism, Godism, will be around that much longer. But again, purpose of this podcast, introduced it by talking about that weird situation with the pimp, but the purpose of it was to talk about Godism. And I thought that the pimp would be a perfect way of introducing it, since he obviously had that kind of Cain and Abel view. And he assumed that because I was Jewish, at least, well, not by religion, but by ethnicity, I guess. Although I'm not sure if I'm ethnically Jewish. I don't think I am, but by ancestry, I suppose. He assumed that based on that I must be a Zionist. And obviously, the guy didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know his P's and Q's. He didn't do any background research. He didn't realize how many anti-Zionist Jews there are in the US. And if he would have known that I was a Marxist, I don't know whether anybody told him that or not. Just based on that, he should have guessed that there's a good chance this guy is an anti-Zionist. Does that mean that there are no Zionist Marxists? No Zionist Marxist communists? No, there are some, sadly. But he didn't know what he meant. I don't blame him for saying that, but for being dishonest with me, for being a pimp, but not being upfront with it. Practicing a kind of heavenly deception, as some people have called it. That I find to be extraordinarily troublesome. And to be honest, I find that to be a little difficult to forgive, although I try the best I can. For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. I hope I have not made that many mistakes this time. Have a pleasant evening and an even better day tomorrow.